Welcome to Boot Camp tutorial number 8, Defensive Fire Principles. I think I may make this a two-parter. Go through the basics in part 1, which would be this part, and then do some more examples in part 2. So let's jump right into it. I've got this first slide showing a high level what defensive fire is. And there are 4 forms of defensive fire. But before I jump into that, I want to just talk a little bit about section A8 from the ASL rulebook, or 3.3.3 from the starter kit rulebook. This is a section that has all the defensive fire principles in it, and it is one of the most utilized rules in the entire rulebook. 99 point something percent of ASL scenarios have infantry in them, and it's in your best interest, I guess I should say, to fully understand, comprehend, and know how to use the defensive fire principles. It's one of the most important, it is the most important with route section in Chapter A, and one of the most important rule section in the entire ASL rulebook, because it is utilized every turn in every game of every scenario, just about every scenario. So make sure you understand this section as well as you can and utilize it to the best of your ability in all the games that you play. Now, there are 4 sections, important sections of defensive fire principles. There's section A 8.1, defensive first fire. Section A 8.3, subsequent first fire. Section A 8.31, final protective fire. And those 3 defensive fire sub-phases occur during the movement phase of your opponent. So when your opponent's moving and you're the defender, you can fire at them using those 3 forms of defensive fire. Then lastly, there's A 8.4, which is final fire. That happens in the defensive fire phase only. That's after all the movement is done and you're moved into the actual defensive fire phase of the player phases, their game phases that you can see up here at the top of the video. So what I have here, and we're gonna look at those in detail here in a minute. What I have here is just a theoretical setup of Americans who are going to be, the attackers are going to be moving, going against some German units in buildings and woods. And I'm going to play this out and see what happens and show you the various forms of defensive fire. And each time we get into a new section, defensive first fire, subsequent first fire, final protective fire, or final fire, I will show you another slide with some summary bullets of each of those types of defensive fire. So let's start out by moving some American units first and see what happens here. I'm gonna wing this, and I'm gonna just start by let me put that guy should be there because I want to move him. Yeah, move him back here. Let's assault move Sergeant Eng and his medium machine gun and squad into Y5. Okay, at this point, movement has started, so Germans have the opportunity to make defensive fire, in this case, defensive first fire. So let me put that slide up and we'll go through the bullet points of what defensive fire actually is and some of its limitations. Like I said, A8.1 is the section for defensive first fire, or section 3.3.3 for starter kit. The rules are a little trimmed down, they're a little more simple, not as detailed, but the fundamentals are the same. A unit cannot be marked with any fire counter to be able to use defensive first fire. If they're marked with any type of fire counter, a first fire counter, final fire counter, they cannot use first fire. They have to be marked with no counter. It occurs only during the opponent's movement phase. I just moved, so first fire can occur at this point. It is movement factor dependent, meaning the defender, the Germans in this case, cannot attack any unit that has not expended movement factors. And movement factor expenditure doesn't necessarily mean actually moving. It could mean making a smoke grenade attempt from the same hex. It could mean placing a demo charge, which costs movement factors, but you're not actually moving. It could mean moving from open ground into a foxhole in the same hex. That costs 1 movement factor. You could be fired on doing that, even though you're technically not moving. You're just moving under a foxhole counter. So there are situations where expenditure of movement factor can cause you to get attacked, even though you're not actually physically moving to a different location or hex on the board. All forms of defensive fire can leave residual firepower, and I'm going to gloss over that a little bit in this video, and I'm going to go have a different video on how residual fire and fire lanes work. And residual fire can be reduced to 0 depending on hindrances, cowering, etc. That happens, and I'll go into that in another video. And then any unit that uses defensive first fire, when they're done, they're marked with a first fire counter, which looks like this. And I'll show you that in a second, because I'm going to take a shot at Sergeant Eng and his squad that just assault moved for 2 into that hex. If you want to review assault movement, go back to tutorial number 3, which is infantry movement, and there should be a timestamp of how to use assault movement. So they expended 2 to move into that hex. Any German unit that has line of sight to them can take a defensive first fire shot at this point. We are in the movement phase. Excuse me. I'm going to take a shot with Lieutenant Zabrecht here. He's a 9-1 with a medium and a squad. Okay, so firepower is 9, which goes down to 8 on the table. Oh, let me interject here. I'm going to put up, instead of doing this over and over, showing you the infantry fire table, I'm going to superimpose a small portion of the infantry fire table, just the part that we need right over here during this entire video. I'll pop that in there right now, so I'm not doing this back and forth thing. Okay, so that goes down to 8 because there's a 8 column on the infantry fire table, and then the die roll modifiers are going to be -1 for his leadership, -1 leadership. There is going to be a +1 for Woods, Tem, and there is no -1 for first fire non-assault movement because I declared assault movement. So that does not apply. If I had moved in there normally and just spent 2 and declared normal movement, there would be a -1 first fire non-assault movement, but I assault moved into that hex and stopped. So that is an 8 firepower +0, which is I call that an even shot. So it's an 8 even. Let's roll, see what we get on the chart over there. 8 even. 8 on an 8 is a morale check. That's one thing. If you're new to the game, you'll learn that pretty quickly. A final die roll of an 8 on 8 firepower is a normal morale check. So I have a morale of 8. Leader goes first. Leader passes. He can apply his -1. The squad has a 7 morale. Second line squad. So I need an 8 to pass, and he passes. Okay. Now, this squad and machine gun, a couple things to consider here. So they first fired at this moving unit, so I put a first fire counter on it. That's the requirement. Second thing is residual firepower. They fired with 8 firepower factor. I don't think he got rate of fire. I forgot to check that. So he leaves 4. Sorry, he leaves 6. Sorry, 4 residual fire. Half the original. So there are 4 residual firepower in that hex. Now, if another unit moved into that hex, they would be automatically attacked with 4 firepower without anyone having to fire on it, just moving into that residual firepower. Okay. Well, one other thing to consider. It's a medium machine gun that was fired with a squad, but the medium machine gun is in a wood building. If a medium or heavy machine gun is in a woods, a building, or rubble, their covered arc gets locked um, on how they fire. Now I have two options here. These guys have to be within the covered arc, so I could define the covered arc as looking like this. That's one option. Because once you lock the covered arc, you can't fire at anything outside the covered arc. Or I could lock the covered arc like this, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to lock the covered arc on the red option there, because they might get a chance to fire at these guys later. But probably not, because I might subsequent first fire here. Okay. And there's a covered arc counter to lock it in like that. I'll leave the red markers up there just to show you where the covered arc of the medium machine gun is locked in. And this is a pretty critical target, so I might do subsequent first fire on this guy. Okay, he expended 2 movement factors. Here's the movement factor dependency part of defensive first fire and subsequent first fire. The same unit can only fire at a moving target equal to up to the number of movement factors expended by that unit moving into that hex. They expended 2 moving into that hex, so this unit can subsequent first fire on them. If they had only spent 1, for example, going into that hex, these units could not fire on them again. Okay, but in this case they did, so I'm going to subsequent first fire and take a shot at them again because there's a leader there and a machine gun. I'm getting a little worried about these guys. I don't want them pounding on me later. Okay, so let's go through subsequent first fire since we're doing it at this point. Subsequent first fire is section A 8.3. And again, it's 3.3.3 for starter kit players. It's a secondary form of defensive fire. It's available to infantry marked with a first fire counter. It's not available to anything other than infantry and their support weapons. AFVs can't do it with their main armament. AFVs can't do it with their machine guns. It's only for infantry able to do that. It's considered area fire, which means any fire by a unit or fire group using subsequent first fire is at half firepower. Furthermore, any support weapons that are used during subsequent first fire must use what's called sustained fire, meaning let me write this down here. Sustained fire, this is important. Sustained fire. I think the point is that when you keep firing a weapon, there's a higher chance of the weapon malfunctioning or the unit burning through all of its ammunition, something like that. So sustained fire has penalties to the breakdown number. So the original breakdown number becomes an elimination number, and the new breakdown number is 2 less than the original. So the new breakdown number is the original breakdown number minus 2. So in this case, for this medium machine gun, the breakdown number for it is 12. So the new breakdown number, if I sustain fire it, is 10. The original breakdown number was 12, like I said, and that becomes, now it's elimination number, automatic elimination if you roll a 12. Before, if you rolled a 12, it would just break down and then you could repair it. If you roll a 12 with sustained fire, it's gone forever. It's toast. And if you roll 10 or more, then it breaks down. So you're increasing your chance of screwing up your support weapons by using sustained fire, which is what I'm going to do. So let's let's subsequent first fire these guys here. Okay. Oh, and lastly, a unit that subsequent first fire is marked with a final fire counter. Okay. So it's area fire. They expended 2 there, so I can fire at them again. And they are another part of subsequent first fires. You have to fire at the unit either closest or equal to the closest enemy unit. So there are 2 hexes. There are 2 hexes. I can fire at them again. If these guys had been here for whatever reason, I could not fire at them again. I think the idea here is once you start firing and you get into the mechanics of firing, your focus starts shifting towards things that are closest to you once you take your first shot. But in this case, they're equal distance, so I can fire at them again using subsequent first fire. So I meet all the requirements for subsequent first fire. The original was a 9 firepower. That goes down to, this case, we're not going to reduce it directly to 8. We're going to do it the right way. So that's 9 medium machine gun plus a squad. It's area fire, so that goes down to a 4.5. It's half. And if you look at over here at the infantry fire table, there's a 4 column. So basically it's 4 firepower, and it's a plus 1 tem, minus 1 leader. My penmanship is crap, so 4 firepower plus 0 even. Before it was an 8. That makes sense. Area fire, half firepower. Diral modifiers are the same. So we're at a 4 even. We need to watch our final roll to see if we break our medium machine gun. And we're still in the covered arc. 6 on a 4. That should be a normal morale check again. We did not break our medium machine gun. They are immediately marked with a final fire counter. And I need to make a normal morale check. Leader 8. Leader broke. Squad is a 7. Passed, but leader broke, so he has to take a leader lost task check, not a morale check, just a task check. And he passed, so he's okay. Just the leader broke there. DM counter, residual, in case anyone moves into that hex. Okay, so we've done a quick example of final fire and subsequent first fire. They're done moving because they assault moved. They can only move 1 hex with assault movement, and they're going to stop there. Okay, I'm going to take this unit here, and I'm going to assault move to there. These guys are final fired. They cannot fire unless there's a unit adjacent to them, which is final protective fire. I'll get into that, show an example here in a minute. But I am going to have this squad take a shot at them. So they're at range 4, which is well within their range of 6. I'm not going to go through the details. I'm just going to write out what it is. It's going to be a 4. I assault moved, so it's just going to be a 4 plus 1 diral modifier. 4 firepower plus 1, because I assault moved into that hex. Check the chart. Check the chart to the left on this roll. 8, 9 on a 4 is a nothing. They are first fired. That leaves 2 residual in that hex. Now, I spent 2 movement factor moving in here, just like these guys did. They could be fired on again, but there's no one that can fire on them. You might think, well, why can't these guys? Because they're not the closest enemy unit. Subsequent first fire, you can only fire at a moving target if they're eligible, if they are closer than or equal to the closest distance, the closest enemy. In this case, these guys are closer, so their focus kind of shifts to them. They're not able to fire on anyone unless an American unit moves within 3 or less hexes of them. Then they could use subsequent first fire on some American unit, which they might do here down the road as an example. Okay, so they're done moving, no result. Residual firepower. They first fired. They can't fire on them again. So it's time to move another unit. Let's move these guys normally. They're going to go 2. Now I have 3 fire opportunities here. These guys could subsequent first fire because they're at 3 hexes, which is the same as these guys. 3 hexes, which is the same as these guys, which is 3 hexes. So theoretically, they could subsequent first fire. These guys, because they're marked with a first fire counter, they can only subsequent first fire. These guys could first fire at them. These guys could also first fire at them. I think I'm not going to subsequent first fire these guys. I think I'm not going to fire. I think I'm going to, because I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to move here for 4, just for illustration purposes. And then these guys are going to first fire. They're not marked with a counter yet, so they can first fire. Okay. 4 firepower goes to 8 for point blank firepower. Double because it's adjacent. And then you've got +1 TEM for the woods. -1 first fire non-assault movement. I didn't declare non-assault movement. I'm moving normally, so there's a -1 modifier. There's no -1 for FMO, first fire movement in the open, because I am not moving in the open. So we've got 8 plus 0. It's an even, 8 even shot. And the German second squad to the American first squad there. 8 even. They cowered, brutally cowered. There's no leadership leading those guys. Now, when you cower, if you have, unless you're British, or if you have a leader with them, you are immediately marked with a final fire counter. There's no penalty for rolling 12 when you fire just infantry. If you have a support weapon, there is a penalty. It'll break down. These guys had no support weapon. They just cowered really, really bad. No result. And they're instantly marked with a final fire counter. Okay. Now they can fire again. I'm not going to in this case. They could do final protective fire on these guys, but I am not going to. I'm going to use final protective fire example when I move these guys over here. Okay. And I'm not going to fire these guys. I'm going to save them for just a final fire example. That leaves residual there, but the residual is going to be reduced because they cowered. So it's going to be, it was a 8, so it's going to go down to a 4, then down to a 2 because they cowered. So there'd be 2 residual there. I think that was a first line, second line. Yeah, okay. Down to a 2. Okay, let's keep moving here. Let's move 1, 2. Yeah, let's move these guys here. But first, I'm going to try to deploy smoke here. Yeah, let's do that. He has a smoke exponent of 3. I'm going to try to get in close. So I have to roll a 3 or less to deploy smoke there. And to deploy smoke into an adjacent hex costs 2 movement factors. So I need a 3 or less. If I roll a 6, he's pinned and can't move. I deployed smoke. Nice. Do I have a smoke counter? Yes. Okay. So that cost me 2 movement factors. Theoretically, he could be fired on because I expended 2 movement factors, but he can't fire because he's final fired. He can only fire at adjacent units for final protective fire. These guys could subsequent first fire, but they're too far away. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. These guys are closer. Their attention is over on these guys now because they're closer. They're like, holy crap, these guys are getting close. Focus on those guys. Ignore these guys over here. So they can't fire, do subsequent first fire yet. Now, I'm going to move. So 2 movement factors for smoke. 1 open ground, +1 moving into smoke. So that's 4. Okay, now I have opportunities here. These guys could final protective fire, and these guys could subsequent first fire. Now they're within 2. They're the same range as these guys where their focus was because they were closest. But these guys are just as close, and they're like, hey, see those guys in the smoke? Maybe we should fire on them. But first, I'm going to do final protective fire just to show you how that works. So let me pop up the final protective fire slide so we can go through those bullets real quick. So final protective fire is the last form of movement, last part of defensive fire that can be done in the movement phase. Okay, it's in section A 8.31, again 3.3.3 in the starter kit. It's a secondary form of subsequent first fire, so it also is area fire. And again, it's available only to infantry marked with the final fire counter, which we have here. And it can only fire at same or adjacent hexes. I just moved into an adjacent hex. These guys can now fire at them with final protective fire. It's considered area fire, like I just mentioned. Now here's the kicker, this last bullet. This is what can get you or help you depending on your circumstances. The original infantry fire table die roll acts as a normal morale check for units that fire. Random selection applies. Now this sub-bullet here, there may be situations when you want your units to fail their normal morale check when using final protective fire. In situations where you're just being swarmed by units that want to get into close combat with you or get in close to bring a bunch of fire to bear, and you know you're going to lose that objective, whatever it is, that building, that bunker, whatever, and you want to fight, live to fight another day. One way to get out of it is you just final protective fire as much as you can and hope you either get a result or your units break, and then you can get out of dodge during the route phase. You'll lose your hex most likely, but you may not lose your units in close combats where the odds are way in your opponent's favor, which is usually what they're trying to do. Get in close with a bunch of units, jump into close combat, take you out. This way, final protective fire as much as you can. Eventually, you'll probably fail a morale check based on the infantry fire table die roll, and then you can route out of it. So we meet all the requirements for final protective fire. I'm marked with the final fire counter. Units are adjacent and they're moving, and they expended 2 movement factors. So I could theoretically final protective fire twice on these guys because they expended 2. The kicker is the machine gun. Look at the covered arc. Medium machine gun is locked in. It's already committed, and it's already fired in this covered arc. They fired at these guys, if I recall. The medium machine gun cannot be used in final protective fire in this case, so only the squad can be used. Yeah. Jeez. Stack management. It's not even a big stack. It's a 4.6.7. Medium machine gun is not applicable. So 4 firepower. That goes to 8 for point blank fire. Whoop. Point blank fire to an adjacent hex. And then it goes back down to 4 firepower because it's a form of subsequent first fire, so it's treated as area fire. So the final is 4 firepower. And the die roll modifiers are -1 leadership, -1 non-assault movement, first fire non-assault movement, +1 smoke, or no, is it +2? +2 smoke. My bad. +2 smoke. You might think that there's a -1 for first fire movement in the open. That does not apply. Smoke negates moving in the open. I'm moving through. I just threw out smoke grenades and ran in there. First fire movement in the open does not apply. So we've got a 4 firepower plus 0. So it's an even attack with that squad in there using final protective fire. And the oh yeah, I got the leadership in there. Yep. And the original die roll acts as a morale check. So let's see what we get. 4 even. Ooh, that's bad. Okay. It's no result, but it's an 11. So random selection, top to bottom. Green is top. Snake eyes. Of course I roll snake eyes. It just means it's a tie. So both of them have to take a normal morale check, the leader and the squad. Leader, normal morale check, passes. He can use his leadership modifier. It's a -1 now with the leadership. They pass. They both pass. Okay. I can, let me put, I don't have another residual. There's 2 residual there. Um, Actually, there may be no residual because of the smoke. I'll have to get, when I go through the residual firepower tutorial, I'll get into more detail on that. It's either 2 or 0, but no other unit's going to move in there. But this squad expended 2 movement factors to get in there. These guys fired. They passed their morale check. They're still good. They're marked with the final firepower. They can final protective fire again. I'm gonna. Same. I won't be able to final protective fire again because they expended 2. I can only do it twice with this unit. But it's basically a 4 even again. Why not? Let's see what we get. 8 on a 4 is a nothing. I just missed a pin task check. A pin task check would have been good. It would have kept him from advancing into close combat. 8 morale check. They have different morale levels, so let's check again. Random selection. Green is top leader. Bottom 8. He has a morale of 7, but he's stacked with a leader. So I rolled an 8. The final result would be a 7. He would be pinned. The squad and machine gun would be pinned. Actually, probably just the machine gun would be pinned because it's manned by the. Gosh, I cannot. It's like one of these is a little bit different width. I can't grab it. I cannot final protective fire again. That's all I can do. 2. That's because I spent 2 movement factors moving in there with the smoke. Okay. So they're done moving. They're going to stop there. They spent 4 movement factors. I'm going to move these guys now. So I'm going to go, let's see. I guess I could go 1 to there. He can't fire. He can't subsequent first fire. These guys are closer. These guys are closer. He's focused on, these guys. These guys cannot final protective fire. It's only adjacent or in hex units. In hex, if you happen to be berserk and charge into the hex, or it's part of a bonsai charge, a human wave, you can actually get into the hex during the movement phase and be fired on at triple point blank fire. But these guys can't fire on them. No one else has line of sight, so that's 1. That's 2.5 to there. Okay, at this point, he could subsequent first fire. He's at the same distance as all these other ones that are close to him. But I think I'm gonna have him wait because I'm gonna move to here for 4. Now I have opportunities again. These guys could subsequent first fire. They spent 1.5 there, but it's rounded down for defensive fire purposes, so he only expended 1 movement factor there. So he can only be fired upon once, or 1 by each fire group. So I'm gonna subsequent first fire these guys here. And it's gonna be point blank area fire, right? So it's gonna be doubled and then half. So it's gonna be 4 firepower. The modifiers are gonna be non-assault -1 for first fire non-assault movement. I'm moving normally. FNAM. And that's it. There's no terrain effect modifier for a wheat. 0 tem. Dang it. Eraser. 0 tem for grain. Grain is only a hindrance, and the fire isn't going through a grain hex. It's going into a grain hex. So 0 tem. So this is actually going to be a 4 firepower -1 shot, which isn't too bad. You can get a good, you got a 50-50 chance to get a result on a 4 -1. Probably better than 50-50. 5 on a 4. That is a 1 MC. What kind of squad is that? That is a 666. Ooh, I need to roll a 5. +1 morale check. Stop. 5. He's pinned. So the final roll is a 6. 5 + 1 is a 6, which equals my morale, which means he is pinned, which is probably exactly, not exactly, but I would take that. When you have units rushing in to potentially get into close combat, a pin is just as good as almost breaking because they cannot advance. Now, these guys subsequent first fired, they're flipped over to final fired. Whoop. I cannot final protective fire these guys because there was only one and a half rounded down to 1 movement factor, and they already fired. They made their 1 shot using subsequent first fire. So these guys cannot final protective fire, but these guys can. Another unit moved adjacent to them. You can final protective fire as many times as you want, as long as you meet the requirements of being marked with a final fire counter, and a unit is moving either adjacent to you or into your hex, and you're still good order and can fire. Again, but they're outside the covered arc of the machine gun, so only the squad, I believe the squad is pinned. Yeah, the squad is pinned, so it's a 4. So this is going to be interesting. So the base firepower is 4. They're pinned, so it goes to 2 for pinned. Goes back up to 4 for point blank. Point blank fire. Then it goes back down to 2 for area fire because we're using final protective fire, which is a form of subsequent first fire. So it's going to be a 2. Got -1 for leadership and -1 for first fire, not assault movement, which is not too shabby. 2 -1. We had a 4 -1 here. 2 -1 because they're pinned, essentially, compared to this squad. And then a leadership, extra leadership modifier. 2 -2, which isn't too bad. 8 or less, you get a result. 8 or less. I got a 6. That's a pin check. They're already pinned, so they're immune. They only expend 1 movement factor there, so these guys can only fire once. And that's it for the offensive fire principles during the actual movement phase. I'm not moving any more units, so basically movement is done. Everything other than final fire is done. So let's move to the final fire phase, if you look at the phases up here, and talk about that for a second. There's one opportunity for final fire here. So final fire is section A 8.4, which is 3.4 in the starter kit rulebook. This occurs during the defensive fire phase after all movement is done. The attacker has done moving. Defender has taken all of his defensive first fire, subsequent first fire, and final protective fires. Unfired units can fire at any enemy units. So any unit that's not marked with a fire counter can fire at any unit they have line of sight to. I left these guys unfired so I could fire somebody. Oh, all residual fires counters go away at the end of the movement phase. Okay. Okay. Yeah, unfired units can fire at any enemy units. First fire units, if any unit is marked first fire, they can fire at same hex units or adjacent hex units. We don't have any of those in this case, but these guys cowered and were immediately marked with the final fire counter. If they hadn't have cowered and they were still marked with a first fire, these guys, because they're adjacent, they could final fire at them. It's a form of subsequent first fire, so it would be half as area fire. Okay. So all we have left essentially is this light machine gun and I think half squad up here. Yep. They're just going to take a normal shot here. My whiteboard is getting really messy here. There are no firepower modifiers. It's just a straight 5 firepower, which goes down to 4 firepower on our chart over here. And then a Dyro modifier is +1 for Woods Tem. So it's a 4 + 1 final fire. Probably going to be a nothing. 6, 7 on a 4, pin check. Doesn't really matter much after movement is done. Well, it could matter because they could bring less fire to bear on these guys in advancing fire phase. So pin check, they are pinned. And I don't have another pin counter. I'll put, they're pinned. I don't have another one handy. And then these guys are marked with a final fire counter, if I have one. And that is the end of this theoretical movement and defensive fire scheme. So I showed you how to do basic mechanics of movements and how to defensive fire against them during the movement phase using defensive first fire, subsequent first fire, final protective fire, and the requirements to use each of those. And then once movement is completely done, who can do final fire during the defender's straight up defensive fire phase, as you see up here. That's it for principles of defensive fire. I think I will do a second example just to run through it, move some stuff around, see how you can do defensive fire against moving units and static units and that kind of thing. And I think I'll do that after this video sometime. And then I'll probably get into a little more detail on residual fire. I just threw residual fires down just to show that you should be doing it as you're firing at moving units, so that if any other moving units move into that hex, they get attacked by that residual fire. And then I'll probably tack in fire lanes and how to do fire lanes with residual fire after that. Okay, let me do my obligatory roll low row, roll low row. It's hard to say, tongue-tied. Snake eyes. I already rolled snake eyes. 6. All right, roll low. I'll see you later.